A woman sent her kids off to school and was getting ready for work when a fire broke out in her house. The firefighters quickly put out the flames, but they immediately noticed a few suspicious things, and soon even more strange details emerged. For over 30 years, this mystery remained unsolved until investigators uncovered a shocking twist straight out of a detective movie that finally revealed the truth. Joy Hibbs was born on September 23, 1955, in the small town of Chiefland, Florida. She was the youngest of 9 siblings and grew up surrounded by a big, loving family. Joy loved being outdoors. She enjoyed hiking, fishing, and pretty much anything related to nature. She was also into sports. Back in her school days, Joy got into running and even competed in marathons. She was also a huge football fan and made sure never to miss her favorite team's game. While in high school, Joy met a guy named Charlie. The two quickly hit it off, and not long after graduation, they got married. Soon after, the couple decided to move to Pennsylvania, settling in a small town called Senator. Joy had always dreamed of working in the medical field, but without a formal education, she could only find entry-level jobs. She spent some time working as a veterinary assistant, but eventually decided to take courses at a local college to earn a medical degree. That paid off, and she landed a job as a physical therapist at a small clinic close to home. In 1975, when Joy was 20, she and Charlie welcomed their first child, a daughter, and 3 years later, they had a son. The family moved into a nice, quiet neighborhood and seemed to live a peaceful, happy life. To their friends and relatives, it looked like Joy and Charlie had built the perfect family, a true embodiment of the American dream. But everything changed on April 19, 1991. That day, 35-year-old Joy was scheduled to work the evening shift. She got the kids ready for school, said goodbye to her husband as he left for work, and started preparing for her shift. Joy also ran some errands. She went to the grocery store and stopped by the bank to cash a check. Around 1 p.m., her 12-year-old son, David, came home from school and noticed his mom's car parked outside the house. Excited to share the good grades he'd gotten that day, he ran toward the house, eager to see her reaction. But his excitement quickly turned to worry. As he got closer, he saw thick smoke coming from inside. At first, he thought his mom might have left something on the stove, but the moment he opened the door, he saw flames spreading through the house. Panicking, David tried to go inside to find his mom, but the smoke and fire made it impossible. Meanwhile, neighbors noticed the smoke and called the fire department. Firefighters quickly arrived at the scene and managed to extinguish the flames. But when they reached the last room of the house, they discovered a human body. When paramedics and police arrived, they immediately assumed the body was Joy. But because of the severe burns, they couldn't make a 100% positive identification, so the remains were sent to medical examiners for confirmation. Meanwhile, news of the fire spread quickly through the town. Joy's daughter, who was at school at the time, heard about what had happened and rushed home, only to find her younger brother in tears. Shortly after, Joy's husband arrived at the scene, and the moment police informed him about the body that had been found, he collapsed unconscious. At the time, firefighters were still trying to figure out what caused the fire, but Joy's son couldn't stop blaming himself. You see, he had a computer in his room, and all the cables were messily plugged into a single socket near the fish tank. Since his mom's body was found in his bedroom, he assumed the fire started because of his carelessness and that she'd been trying to put out the fire. However, while putting out the flames, firefighters noticed some strange details. It seemed like the fire had started in several different areas of the house, something that's almost unheard of in an accidental fire. A closer look only confirmed their suspicions. Investigators found 4 separate points where the fire had been set. While they couldn't pinpoint exactly how it started, one thing was certain: this wasn't an accident. It was arson. Moreover, all 4 gas burners on the kitchen stove had been left on, with traces of debris scattered across them. This suggested that the arsonist used something to spread the fire from the stove to other parts of the house. The arson theory was soon backed up by the medical examiner's report. They confirmed the victim was Joy and revealed there were no traces of smoke in her lungs, meaning she was already dead before the fire began. But the most chilling discovery was what they found on her body. There were multiple cuts, bruises, and stab wounds. With this new information, the case was reclassified as a homicide, and investigators began searching for evidence. But it wasn't easy. The fire had destroyed most of the house, leaving little to work with. On top of that, no foreign DNA was found on Joy's body. So, with no physical clues, detectives shifted their focus to identifying possible suspects. The first person they looked into was Joy's husband, Charlie. He had been at work when the fire started, but the police couldn't completely rule out the possibility that he might have left, committed the crime, and then returned to work to set up an alibi. However, there were no signs of serious marital problems. Family and friends all said the couple seemed happy, and Charlie appeared genuinely devastated by his wife's death. Despite this, detectives continued to investigate him as a potential suspect for a while, but eventually shifted their focus to other possible leads. Investigators began questioning Joy's friends and co-workers, asking if she had any conflicts or if anyone might have had a reason to harm her. But everyone said the same thing: Joy was a kind and caring person who never got into trouble. Investigators also considered the possibility that Joy might have been a random target. From her husband, they learned that every Friday, she cashed a check at the bank, and on the day of the fire, she would have had some cash. However, her wallet, which was found on the couch, was empty. Her purse had also been dumped out on the kitchen floor as if the perpetrator was searching for something specific. Police theorized that someone might have followed her home from the bank or broken into the house intending to rob it. But this theory didn't hold much weight because, other than a relatively small amount of cash, nothing else was missing from the house. The perpetrator didn't touch any valuable items, making the robbery angle seem unlikely. So, detectives began leaning toward the idea that this was a targeted attack. It wasn't long before they uncovered some unsettling details about Joy's life in the months before her death. Her family revealed a series of strange and troubling incidents that had recently taken place. On one occasion, someone threw a brick through their window. Another time, their front door was damaged, and the tires on Joy's car were slashed while it was parked in front of the house. At the time, Joy and Charlie assumed these were random acts of vandalism and didn't think much of it. But now, after her murder, all of these incidents seemed connected. The police started digging into who might be behind all this and began questioning Joy's neighbors. While no one remembered seeing anything unusual around the house during these incidents, they did share something intriguing. Just before the fire started, several neighbors spotted a blue Monte Carlo parked in front of Joy's house. But unfortunately, no one got a look at the driver or the license plate. When detectives asked Joy's family about the car, they got their first big lead. Joy's son mentioned that his mom's friend, April, sometimes drove a car like that. Digging deeper, investigators learned that April and her husband, Robert, had lived just a few houses away from Joy, but they had recently lost their home due to financial troubles and moved away. According to Joy's friends and family, she and April had struck up a friendship shortly after April's family moved into the neighborhood. There was more to April's story, though. Neighbors describe her husband, Robert, as a violent man with a bad temper, and there were rumors that he physically abused her. Because of this, April often spent time at Joy's house along with her kids, looking for a safe space away from her home. Joy's son also told detectives about some conflict between Robert and his mother. He recalled overhearing a phone conversation where Robert not only yelled at her but openly threatened her. Police started digging into Robert's background and quickly discovered a long rap sheet, mostly for drug-related offenses. Taking this into account, detectives began to seriously consider him as a suspect. They theorized that Robert might have harbored resentment toward Joy for supporting his wife and giving her a safe place to stay, and this anger could have escalated to murder. Police contacted the Narcotics Division, which had dealt with Robert numerous times in the past, to gather more insight into his background. The officers there agreed to assist and even offered to speak with Robert, given their familiarity with him from prior cases. However, Robert denied having anything to do with the crime. He claimed he had been out of town the entire weekend on vacation with his wife and kids. But since the murder happened on a Friday afternoon, detectives realized it was entirely possible for him to have stopped by Joy's house before heading out on the trip. Another curious detail was a fresh scratch on Robert's arm, which the officers noticed during their conversation. But despite this, Robert maintained his innocence. In the following days, Robert completely stopped cooperating with investigators, citing advice from his lawyer. When detectives attempted to persuade him to take a polygraph test, Robert refused and continued to avoid further contact with them. The police shifted their focus to finding evidence that could link Robert to the crime. Since they still hadn't found any solid leads inside the house, they returned to the neighbors who had spotted the blue car outside Joy's home and took them to Robert's residence, hoping they could identify his vehicle. But unfortunately, detectives faced another setback. Robert's Monte Carlo wasn't blue, it was black, and the neighbors said it didn't look like the car they had seen outside Joy's house. Detectives also verified Robert's alibi and established that he and his family had indeed checked into a hotel in another city on Friday, the day of the murder. Moreover, just before leaving home, Robert had been on the phone with one of his wife's friends, and this conversation took place around the same time Joy was killed. With this information, investigators began to reconsider Robert's status as the main suspect and shifted their focus back to pursuing other leads. Investigators then decided to take another look at the victim's husband, Charlie, and this time they uncovered something interesting. Speaking with Joy's co-workers, detectives learned that she had been receiving threatening phone calls. According to one co-worker, she suspected the caller might have been Joy's husband, but she never asked her about it. Despite this new information, Charlie had a solid alibi. Several co-workers confirmed he was at work on the day of the murder. However, investigators couldn't completely rule out the possibility that he might have left, committed the crime, and returned without anyone noticing. In the following months, investigators continued to question Charlie, bringing him in for several polygraph tests, but nothing in his behavior suggested he was involved in his wife's murder. Charlie had no criminal record and no history of aggressive behavior toward Joy throughout their marriage. Eventually, police concluded that his involvement was probably unlikely. After that, the case hit a dead end. With no solid evidence or clear suspects, investigators couldn't make any progress at all, and Joy's case was basically put on hold. Occasionally, efforts were made to revisit the case, but each attempt led to a dead end. This continued for several decades. By that time, Joy's children had grown up, and the lack of progress in solving their mother's murder haunted them. Her son repeatedly contacted the police, urging them to reopen a full investigation, but each communication ended in disappointment. In one conversation with detectives, they said they still considered his father, Charlie, responsible for the murder but didn't have the evidence to prove it. In 2014, 23 years after the murder, the case was finally reopened. It was assigned to the Cold Case Unit, where a fresh team of detectives started reviewing all the evidence from scratch. And it didn't take long for them to notice something odd. Detectives discovered that much of the communication with Robert, one of the primary suspects, had been handled by the Narcotics Division. This was not only unusual but also unprofessional, as it involved a murder investigation. The new team struggled to understand why a completely unrelated department had been so deeply involved. The detectives decided to speak with one of the investigators who had worked on Joy's case back in 1991. At first, he refused to discuss the murder, but after multiple attempts, they managed to persuade him to answer their questions. What the retired detective revealed left them stunned. He admitted that, from the very beginning, Robert seemed like the most likely suspect. However, there was one significant problem. The investigators were basically instructed to stay away from Robert and essentially drop any efforts to link him to the murder because he was an informant for the Narcotics Division. While it was known at the time that Robert was an informant, the detectives believed this shouldn't have interfered with a murder investigation. But as it turned out, Robert was a key informant in a massive narcotics case, and the police department didn't want to jeopardize the years-long operation targeting a major drug trade business. As a result, the original investigators barely pursued Robert as a suspect, conducting only a superficial investigation into his potential involvement. These revelations mark a turning point in Joy's case, and the new team of detectives began building a case against Robert. Back in 1991, the police determined that Robert had a solid alibi, but the new investigators knew they couldn't rely on outdated records. So, they decided to verify everything themselves. The first step was to track down Robert's wife's friend, the one he supposedly called around the time of Joy's murder. She confirmed that the call did happen, but there was a key detail the original investigators had missed. The call wasn't in the afternoon, it was much later, closer to the evening. Next, the detectives re-interviewed the witnesses who had reportedly seen Robert with his wife and children when they checked into the hotel. According to the case files, the family arrived shortly after lunch, but the witnesses contradicted this, stating the family actually checked in around 5 p.m. This timeline left Robert enough time to commit the murder. Finally, the investigators decided to question April. By then, she and Robert were divorced, but she still supported his alibi, insisting he couldn't have been involved in the crime. Detectives pressed her multiple times, hoping she'd reveal more, but she stuck to her original story. So, the detectives shifted their focus to uncovering new leads and re-examining all the evidence they had. This process stretched on for several years until something completely unexpected happened. In 2016, April walked into the police station and said she wanted to talk. She revealed that a series of negative events in her life had led her to reconsider her position on Joy's murder. April confessed that she had been lying about her ex-husband's alibi the entire time and that the real story was far from what she had originally claimed. According to her, on the day of the murder, Robert came home covered in blood. When she asked him what had happened, he simply said, "I stabbed someone and set a house on fire." He then demanded that she pack up the kids for a trip, and they drove to another city under the pretense of a weekend getaway. Robert also brought along a large bag. When they went for a walk in the park, he left April and the kids, disappearing into the woods. When he returned a few minutes later, the bag was gone. April realized her husband had killed Joy only a few days later when detectives came to their house. She confronted Robert and begged him to confess, but instead, he beat her and threatened to pin the crime on her if she ever spoke up. Thus, 4 years, April had been too afraid to testify against Robert. But she finally found the courage to take the right step. Her testimony drastically changed the direction of the case, but detectives knew they still needed some concrete evidence or a confession. So, they came up with a plan and asked April to help them prove her ex-husband's involvement. The police wired April and staged a scene where officers arrived at her house to question her. Right after that, April called Robert and told him that detectives had just asked some questions about Joy's murder and she didn't know what to do. Robert immediately insisted that she refuse to talk to the police and avoid answering any questions. His reaction didn't suggest innocence at all. Everything he said made it clear he was only trying to dodge responsibility. With this recording in hand, detectives began preparing the case for trial. This process took several years, and in May 2022, Robert was finally arrested. He continued to deny his guilt, but the district attorney believed the chances of securing a conviction were very high. The key witness in the case was April, and things seemed to be moving steadily until another unexpected twist turned everything upside down. When Robert's son was called to testify in court, he suddenly revealed that his father had confessed to the murder. According to him, Robert called shortly after the phone conversation with his ex-wife. He said the police were questioning her about the murder and there was a chance he'd end up with a life sentence. Robert told his son he wanted to prepare him for the possibility and then began sharing details of what had happened. While he didn't outright admit to killing Joy, he used phrases like, "I think I did it." This testimony further strengthened an already solid case, but the prosecution still faced one big question. What was Robert's motive? Based on the evidence, he had long been in conflict with Joy and showed a history of aggressive behavior and criminal tendencies. On top of that, it seemed he had taken the cash Joy had withdrawn from the bank just hours before her death. But there was another, much darker theory. When new details about the case emerged and it made headlines again, Robert's relatives from another state contacted the detectives. They hadn't been in touch with him for years, but they were shocked when they saw Joy's photo on the news. They revealed that when Robert was a teenager, he had sexually assaulted and beaten his aunt, who bore a striking resemblance to Joy. This led detectives to consider that Robert may have attacked Joy with the intention of assaulting her, although proving that was no longer possible. Despite this, the jury found Robert guilty of Joy's murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Although justice was finally served in the case, its details sparked justified outrage. Robert had lived freely for over 30 years after committing the murder, largely because the police prioritized protecting a narcotics investigation over pursuing justice for Joy. Essentially, her life was deemed less valuable than a drug trafficking case. Despite this, Joy's family thanked the new team of detectives for their hard work. Her son, who had spent years wondering if his father was involved, an idea planted in his mind by the original investigators, was finally able to learn the truth. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.